Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Shriana. Thank you so much for all the love and coming back another week to listen to another episode where we focus in on someone that we've spoken about in the past or mentioned in our episodes from the Steve Biko times. I think we all remember the trial where Steve Biko was asked to testify and come and give his opinion about elucidate, what Black consciousness is and his involvement. Now we're going to talk about the accused in those trials. And we're going to start with accused number one, Sathasivan, sorry, I hope I got that right, Cooper, known to everyone who ever encountered him as Saths. I can see why you did that. We thank you. It's a tongue twister. Thanks so much. He's one of the most remarkable figures in the entire story of the Black consciousness movement and post-apartheid South Africa. And he's someone whose full story is not well known as it deserves to be. He was banned at 22. He was the lead defendant in one of the most important political trials in South African history. He spent 5 years on Robben Island in the same cell block as Nelson Mandela. And then, after all of that, he built an entirely new career as one of the most distinguished psychologists, eventually becoming the first person from Africa ever to be elected president of the International Union of Psychological Science. This is his story. We begin where all stories begin, with a place. Sathasivan Cooper was born on the 11th of December, 1950, in Kranskloof, a rural community near Claremont Township outside Durban, in what was then the province of Natal. He was the eldest child of Alamo and, Upper Sammy. Very nice. I always like a Sammy name. I do. Upper Sammy Cooper, whose family ran a local school in the area. The Cooper family was an educated one, and Sath grew up surrounded by multiple languages: Zulu, Tamil, Afrikaans, Xhosa, and English, absorbing them from early childhood. The linguistic and cultural plurality of the KwaZulu-Natal region. That early multilingualism would prove formative. It gave him a fluency in crossing boundaries, I can imagine, between communities, between traditions, between ways of understanding the world. That became one of the defining characteristics of his political and intellectual life. He was 9 years old when Sharpeville massacre occurred. Cooper later recalled this as the moment he began to understand with a child's clarity that can sometimes see more plainly than an adult's, that South Africa was divided along racial lines in ways that had consequences, real, violent, permanent consequences. He did not yet have a political framework for that understanding, but the understanding was there, lodged in him, waiting. 9 years old. Cooper completed his secondary schooling at Sastri College in Durban in 1967. Sastri was one of the principal schools for Indian South Africans in the province and its politically charged environment. Students discussing the pass laws, the Land Act, the Grouped Areas Act that was forcibly removing Indian South Africans or relocating those families to peripheral townships, initiated Cooper into political thinking during his teenage years. He later described the school as his first real encounter with activism, including what he called underground, and I don't know why I said it that way, underground pamphleteering, the clandestine distribution of political literature that was already illegal under the apartheid state's accumulating censorship laws. He left Sastri College with a sharp intellect, a growing political consciousness, and an appetite for both theatre and ideas that would shape everything that followed. In 1968, he enrolled for a Bachelor's of Art degree at the University College on Salisbury Island in Durban, an affiliate of the University of South Africa, and another of apartheid's segregated non-white institutions. He was 18 years old. Within a year, everything would change. Wonder if we're going to see the same pattern. At Salisbury Island, Saths Cooper found himself in the middle of a moment. The campus was buzzing with political argument. Students from various segregated, non-white universities were increasingly in contact with each other, talking, debating, meeting. And one of the central questions of the late 1960s for Black South African students was the question of what their relationship to white liberal institutions should be. Through campus politics, Cooper came to meet frequently with a small group of students who would together produce one of the most significant political philosophies in South African history. We've spoken about Biko, Ningwakulu, Pichana, and Srini Mutli, who would become one of Cooper's closest friends and comrades. These conversations in common rooms and cafeterias and late-night rooms were the crucible in which Black consciousness took shape. Cooper was among the founding circle. He was a participant in the thinking that produced the philosophy. He was not a passive recipient of Biko's ideas, but an active converser, someone who argued, contributed, and helped develop the theoretical framework that SASO would eventually articulate to the world. His particular contribution drew in part from his position as an Indian South African, which we spoke about with Srini Mutli too. Someone who embodied in his own person the question of whether Black consciousness could genuinely be what it claimed to be, a coalition of those oppressed by apartheid regardless of ethnic background. We all know what's going to happen next. You can see it coming, right? We've spoken about this enough with the universities and the way they felt about these kids. So, in 1969, Cooper was expelled from the University College of Salisbury Island. Shocker. The official reason has been disputed. Again, shocker. Cooper himself strongly contests accounts that attribute the expulsion to anything other than his political activities. Of course it was. Of course it was. What is clear that his increasingly prominent role in student politics, his organization of the Student Representative Council, and his growing association with the network of activists who were building SASO made him an uncomfortable presence for an institution that was structurally and administratively an instrument of the apartheid government's education policy. We all saw it coming. I saw it coming. The expulsion had an immediate consequence, painful consequence, because he was no longer a student when SASO was formally launched in July 1969. Cooper could not participate in the founding event directly. He had been involved in the intellectual and organizational groundwork. He had been part of the conversation, but he was not in the room when the organization he had helped to conceptualize came into formal existence. This was a bitter irony that the apartheid system specialized in producing. He became a locum teacher, filling in at schools that needed temporary staff while continuing to organize. The government then compounded the expulsion by denying him a passport to take a scholarship he had won to study overseas. Could have just let the guy go. The message was clear. Cooper was someone the state wanted contained. He was not yet banned, not yet tried, but the state was watching. A lot of energy spent on this, right? During this period of exclusion from formal education, Cooper channeled an enormous amount of energy into the Theatre Council of Natal. TechCon. This was the cultural wing of the Black consciousness movement in KwaZulu-Natal, and Cooper was among its founders and its most active organizers. He organized annual drama festivals, brought together theatre companies, helped establish the South African Black Theatre Union with John Carney, Winston Shona, and Srini Mutli. This is not a marginal footnote in Cooper's biography. It was central to understanding him. Black consciousness was, from the beginning, a movement that understood culture as politics. The theatre was not an escape from the struggle. It was a form of struggle, a way of expressing Black experience, Black creativity, and Black dignity in forms that could reach people that pamphlets and political meetings could not. Cooper understood this instinctively and dedicated serious organizational energy to it. He was, in this period of his life, simultaneously a political organizer, a teacher, a theatre organizer, and an activist. Several full-time occupations in one person. When the Black People's Convention was launched in 1972, Cooper became the first public relations officer. He was also, at the same time, active in the Natal Indian Congress, one of the oldest political organizations in the country. His involvement in the NIC reflected the complexity of his political moment. The question of whether Indian South Africans should participate in specifically Indian organizations or whether such organizations were an acceptance of apartheid's project of dividing the oppressed by ethnicity was one of the central debates within the Indian community. Cooper's answer was consistent with Black consciousness philosophy. He urged Indian activists to identify as Black, to embrace the broader coalition of the oppressed, and to see the NIC not as an end in itself, but as a potential channel toward that broader unity. He worked with Srini Mudli to bring NIC members into the BPC, taking many of them with him when he eventually resigned from the NIC. His departure and Mudli's came when the Black consciousness ideology was perceived as a threat by some of the older, more cautious leaders of the Indian community. Cooper was first vice president of the NIC before resigning. The resignation itself was a statement, a demonstration that his commitment to Black consciousness and to the principle that ethnic separatism served the apartheid government's interests was more important than any position within a single community organization. In March 1973, the South African government moved against the Black consciousness movement with its first major coordinated crackdown. That's when everybody got their 5-year banning orders simultaneously, and that was the first layer of leadership. Cooper was part of that 5-year banning order. He was 22 at the time. He was banned and placed under house arrest. He could not attend meetings, he could not be quoted on normal things, and he could not enter educational institutions or newspaper offices. He was at that age, I think they saw him as dangerous at 18, right? Considered dangerous enough by the apartheid state to warrant the same legal erasure that had been applied to Steve Biko, one of the most important political thinkers in the country. The banning order was not a minor inconvenience. It was a comprehensive attempt to remove him from the public life. He was 22. Wow. In September 1974, Mozambique achieved independence from Portugal after years of armed struggle by the Frelimo movement. And I would really love to say the Portuguese name, but I will not. No. For the Black consciousness movement, this was an event of immense significance. A liberation movement in Southern Africa had won. The armed forces of colonial power had been defeated. The cause of liberation in the region was on the march. SASO and BPC decided to hold rallies to celebrate Mozambican independence. These were planned at multiple locations across South Africa, at Curry's Fountain Stadium in Durban, at Tuafloop University in the Transvaal. They were called the Viva Frelimo rallies. The government, alarmed at this open identification with the liberation movement and its implication, banned the rallies on the 24th of September, the day before they were planned to be held. SASO and the BPC held them anyway. At Curry's Fountain Stadium in Durban on the 25th of September 1974, Cooper and his comrades defied the banning order and defied the government ban and staged the rally. The police came with dogs and batons. The pattern continues. The crowd was set upon. People were bitten by police dogs and beaten. And on the 13th of October, 1974, Cooper and a group of fellow activists were arrested under the feared Section 6 of the Terrorism Act, the provision that allowed indefinite detention without trial, without access to lawyers, without notification to your family. You would later note that among those arrested that month was a young student at the University of the North named Cyril Ramaphosa, who would one day be President of South Africa. Professor Saths Cooper later in 2020 said, and I quote, "On October the 13th, 1974, I and a few score activists of SASO and BPC were arrested under the feared section of the Terrorism Act. President Cyril Ramaphosa, then a student in what is now the University of Limpopo, was among those detained throughout South Africa without access to lawyers or anybody besides the notorious security police." What followed the October 1974 arrests was one of the longest, most important, and most closely watched political trials in South African history. 13 people were charged. 4 were eventually acquitted or had charges withdrawn. 9 remained. And the trial that resulted, officially styled the state versus Sathasivan Cooper and others, but known universally as the SASO 9 trial, ran from January 1975 to December 1976, 17 months of proceedings in the Supreme Court in Pretoria. 17 months. Wow. Saths Cooper was accused number 1. His name headed the charge sheet. These 9 men stood charged under the Terrorism Act. The penalty potentially was death. Defenders did not approach the trial as a legal proceeding to be navigated with minimum of exposure. They approached it as a platform. We've seen this before. They understood that the courtroom, with its press coverage and international attention, was an opportunity to articulate Black consciousness to the widest possible audience. They used it with deliberate intention. More than a stage, as one account put it, the defendants used the witness stand as a microphone and indeed as a pulpit. They refused to perform the expected role of the accused, contrite, apologetic, pleading for leniency. They were unapologetic. They were articulate. They were, in the fullest sense, themselves. The trial's most celebrated moment came in May 1976, when Steve Biko, still under the banning order, appeared in Pretoria, took the witness stand as the chief defense witness. Over 5 days of testimony, Biko ranged across the full intellectual landscape of Black consciousness. He discussed the psychological grounding of SASO's slogan, "Black is beautiful." He addressed the importance of disinvestment by foreign firms. He explained with extraordinary clarity what it meant to say that psychological liberation was a prerequisite for political liberation. His cross-examination by the States Council became effectively a seminar in Black consciousness philosophy, conducted at the state's expense, in the state's courtroom, before the state's judge. Cooper and his co-accused watched Biko give that testimony. They understood what was being built in that courtroom, not a defense, but a record, a statement for the present and for history, and what they believed. On the 15th of December 1976, the judge delivered his verdict. All 9 defendants were found guilty. Cooper and most of his co-accused were sentenced to 6 years imprisonment on Robben Island. The charges under the Terrorism Act and the severity of the sentences reflected the state's determination to make an example of these men, to signal to a generation of Black South Africans, to young Black South Africans, what the cost of organizing would be. The sentences did not produce the effect the state intended. The SASO 9 became, in their imprisonment, a symbol of the movement's willingness to endure. The trial had been public. Their arguments had been reported. The philosophy they articulated could not be unarticulated. And on Robben Island, they would not be isolated from the movement's history. They would be in the same cell as the men who had preceded them by a decade. Saths Cooper arrived on Robben Island in 1977. He would spend 5 years there, released on the 20th of December 1982, in the same cell block as Nelson Mandela, Govan Mbeki, Walter Sisulu, and Andimba Dweeba Yadoeva, the Namibian independence leader who had spent more than a decade on the island before. This is Editing Rihanna, who has just realized that this episode is way too long and needs to be cut in half. He's such an interesting person, and I should have seen the writing on the wall when it took me an hour to record this episode. But what I will do is cut off now. There's so much to go through. Post him being in prison and coming out and being so young, there was just so much more life to lead in what he did. Post that and post liberation is just extraordinary. So I'm really excited to tell the rest of his story next week. So come back and have a great week.